It was over 1 year ago that I started my 11-month, 150-hour playthrough of Elden Ring. When I started my playthrough, the game had come out recently and garnered an immense amount of critical and commercial success, achieving a score of 96 on Metacritic. And despite this overwhelming success, I had little interest in playing Elden Ring. I had played some From Software games in the past, but there were a handful of features that were core to the gameplay loop of these games that just didn't appeal to me. We'll get back to that thought in a bit. But a few weeks after the game was released, my interest was piqued just a bit when a small number of AAA, whatever that means nowadays, Western developers publicly criticized certain aspects of the game, namely its quest and UI design. This criticism was covered by some gaming news outlets and some YouTubers, like Yongya and Asmongold. And at that same time, I had been working as both a level designer and a world designer for a AAA company for some years. Considering my past with From Software games and Elden Ring's critical success, I was interested in examining it from a design perspective. So I saw playing Elden Ring and recording my thoughts on it as an opportunity to play a highly rated game that was out of my wheelhouse. I could then use that as a platform to expand on the feedback provided by other Western designers, beyond 140 characters, or, if I disagreed with them, perhaps give some context to their frustration. Brief aside here, I think that AAA, as a consumer-facing term, is a bit antiquated, if it ever really had any value, as players should be more concerned about the cost of a game for them to play it, versus some nebulous development cost categorization. Anyways, based on my experience with previous From Software games, I assumed I'd pick up the game, play it for a few hours at most, and then be overcome with either boredom or extreme frustration, like this.
What the No way through the fucking wall! I've never experienced so much anger towards anything in my life in this game. I'm not kidding.
And then put the game down forever, never to return. But that didn't happen. And after putting nearly 150 hours into Elden Ring, I can confidently say that it has become one of the most engrossing and educational games that I've ever played. Not educational in the traditional sense, obviously, but it challenged so many of my Western design sensibilities in profound ways. And it made me highly critical to my own understandings of the systems and features that I thought were important for the success of open-world RPGs, action games, or other related genres. It's so educational, in fact, that I recommend pretty much any Western designer who's interested in the previously mentioned genres, or aspiring designers, to pick up the game and play it. You may not love it, and it's far from perfect, but what it can teach you is that so many of the design features and priorities that we spend so much time and money developing may not be as vital to the end user experience as we think. It's an amazing case study in game systems and features being heavily deprioritized in spending and quality, with the game still finding massive success. The game is filled with exemplars of high-quality, industry-leading systems and features, but it's also got exemplars of systems that are just functional enough to work, setting its minimum viable product quality for some of its game features well below what some other large-budget studios might be comfortable with releasing.
Look at that.
Where they chose to spend their development money is amazingly insightful. And of course, not all the learnings from Elden Ring's development prioritization will apply to all game types. But I think that it should make developers question, what do we really need to spend development time and money on to get X systems up to X level of quality? What really matters in a game? What do the players actually care about? And how can we prioritize our development and spending to emphasize those features while making other features just good enough? This may be an obvious observation to some, and development and budgeting prioritization is a common tenet of game development, but I've never played a high-budget game that demonstrated that prioritization disparity so clearly. I'll touch on this more as the video progresses. As I discuss my experience with Elden Ring, I don't necessarily want to distinguish between the positives and negatives of the game. In some ways, good game design is subjective, as are all the opinions presented in this video. As players, we don't know what constraints developers are under, be it time, budget, or technical. So some designs that may seem inelegant may have been the best solution given the circumstances. But that won't stop me from being critical of them because I'm petty and envious of Elden Ring's success. And while one may suggest that good game design is actually objective, people find value and fun in different things. Who am I to say that you're a freak because you think long boss runs are not only acceptable in games, but make the game more fun to play? Because it adds more gravity and tension to each attempt at the boss?
You spend a lot of time getting back to the boss, and then you also run the risk of dying getting to the boss? Ugh.
To each their own. Some of the things that irked me in Elden Ring are features that some of my viewers either may be indifferent to, like the game's wealth of physical dead ends without exploratory rewards, or may actually like the game's use of illusory walls. While playing From Software games, it has never been more obvious to me that my design sensibilities do not reflect the desires of all players. As I reflect on my experience with Elden Ring, I'll be discussing the various aspects of the game that I found to be both interesting and impactful, touching on the areas that were likely prioritized and deprioritized from a development and funding perspective. As a note, when I say prioritized, this implies a greater amount of time and money likely went into developing these features relative to some of the game's contemporaries, where deprioritized areas likely had less money and fewer work hours spent. I say likely because I'm committed to doing zero research on the development cycle of Elden Ring, and I'm not bothering to play any other games relevant to this examination purely for the sake of this video, because I'm busy. I got other things to do. This discussion is based on my subjective positive and negative experiences with Elden Ring, anchored in my experience of working as a designer in the AAA industry. Playing AAA games, again, I think that's a silly title. But if it gives me street cred, I'll use it to my advantage, and my understanding of where the development money for these games has generally gone. So what specifically am I going to look at? Well, based on my reasonably educated guess, I think that these are the areas that From Software spent a lot of money on relative to some of their contemporaries, with some exceptions, of course. And I think these are some of the areas that From Software didn't spend quite as much money on. I'll only be touching on the first couple of these in this video. And before you say,
"Hey, dummy! Video games are more complex than that!"
Yeah, obviously. These are just the systems that I found to be interesting based on their excellence or how much their quality diverged from my expectations for a game with such amazing commercial and critical success. For example, I shouldn't bother spending any time talking about the game's music, which is an area I have zero expertise in and almost no business talking about, considering my favorite video game soundtracks comprise of 16-bit grunge and spaghetti western themes. But I'm gonna talk about it anyway. The music of Elden Ring serves to support the mood in the corresponding areas and gameplay beats, which it does pretty well. In some ways, this might be ideal sound design, if that's the goal of the score, or it could be underwhelming if the game is shooting to have an abundance of memorable bangers. But the music is tonally appropriate and doesn't detract from the game experience, so I think that means it's good. As an aside, just because a game's music is more focused on being atmospheric than a banger doesn't mean it can't be memorable, as can be exemplified in countless games. Unfortunately, not a lot of the tracks in Elden Ring resonated with me, so it probably won't be a soundtrack that I revisit for years to come, which is a bit of a bummer. Who doesn't want to love a game's music, especially when spending so much time in the game world? When outside of boss fights, the music, if that's an appropriate term for it, is subtle and largely unmemorable. When inside of the boss fights, the music is much louder and more obvious, but still not particularly memorable, even if it is well produced and thematically supporting. But again, it may not have been the goal of the composer to make these tracks memorable. In From Software's case, maybe it's better sound design to produce less memorable tracks? Because it might be an attempt to immerse the player wholly in the gameplay experience without them paying too much attention to the melody of the music? This is as opposed to creating the music that supports the emotion and theme of the experience, but has a more identifiable melody and is thus more memorable? I don't know. I suspect that's not the case, but I could be totally wrong. Or maybe they just wanted to avoid the player becoming tired of a song's clearly identifiable melody if they're reattempting the same boss fight multiple times. Or maybe I was just too oblivious to the melodies as I was too focused on not dying. Nonetheless, I feel like it's a missed opportunity. There have been levels or encounters in the past that I've played in games that I played once, and the music that supported these encounters stuck with me for decades, even if the music isn't a masterpiece. But with Elden Ring, I can't recall the melody, if there was one, for a single boss fight, no matter how many times I did it. Besides the last boss, because saving the main theme for the last fight of the game was epic. Okay, before I get too deep in discussing Elden Ring, I want to give a bit of a history of my not-so-positive experience with From Software games in the past, and how that might frame my time with Elden Ring. Back in 2015, I played Dark Souls for a frustrating and unproductive 15 or so hours, until I killed about 4 or 5 of the game bosses, with the intention of being able to say, okay, I get it, the game is hard, I understand the gameplay loop, but I don't enjoy it. In the years since, I played part of Dark Souls 3 with cheats so I could observe some of the game's circular level design and how they implemented destructible assets. And then I played Bloodborne for a couple hours until I encountered this thing, it killed me, and then I had no interest in replaying the same space that I just played. Now, the thing that really killed the fun in Dark Souls for me was the run to the boss arenas. I was doing a blind playthrough of the game, and I ended up fighting my way back to the bosses each time I would die. The game has no way of tutorializing how you're supposed to approach the boss runs, so I thought that was the right way to go. I mean, why else would the designers put the boss fight respawn point so far away from the boss encounter unless they wanted you to replay it with some reasonable amount of engagement with the content? Why not put the respawn point right here? Or here? Why not? Now, there may have been some technical limitations that determined the placement of the bonfires that aren't obvious, but each time I had to redo any of the boss fights, it felt like an incredible waste of time. Sure, some could argue that the runs added more gravity to the boss fight, but I found this design to merely add frustration to the experience without positively impacting the significance of each crack I took at the boss. Anyways, in my unrivaled genius, I eventually determined that I could just run by all the creatures right to the boss. No problem. Until this guy right here ended my fun and made me quit Dark Souls. On the run to the gargoyle boss fight, the designers put this raisin-headed fuck in a hallway that's just wide enough so that you have to fight him in order to get past him. At this point, the game was not only requiring you to run back to the boss, but you had to engage with certain enemies along the route in order to get past them, wasting even more time, putting more of your health at risk, and increasing the likelihood that you may not even make it back to the boss fight, where your souls may be laying on the ground waiting for you to recover them. And counter to my previous thoughts, the game showed me that if it forced me to engage with the content en route to the fight, it became an even more frustrating portion of the experience. This again reinforced to me that boss runs were an unfun way to pad out the length of the game, and as someone who sucks at these games as much as I do, I was doing a lot of boss runs. I found the loop of replaying the same space, doing the same boss runs, and the threat of permanent loss of progress in the form of losing souls exhausting. And those feelings were compounded by my frustration with the game for not effectively tutorializing me on how to do boss runs. My time with From Software games made me brace for an experience in Elden Ring, which on the whole, I wouldn't enjoy. However, I think that my expectations from Dark Souls allowed me to enjoy Elden Ring much more than I anticipated, and appreciate the design changes, like the changes to the boss runs, and its limited linear environments more than the average player. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at my experience with Elden Ring. Let's start with something simple, positive, and brief. The combat in Elden Ring is good. The combat in Elden Ring is really good. The combat and the systems that feed into it and interact with it, like creature design and player progression, largely carried the game experience for me. Player-facing, it's relatively simple. You have heavy attack, light attack, weapon skill, block, roll. It doesn't have a combo system that requires precise input for a specific ordering or duration of buttons, like God of War, and the combat isn't obscured behind bombastic visual effects or animations, like a Bayonetta or DMC. Its simplicity and groundedness is its strength. Combat is legible, the animations are weighty and diverse, hit reacts are great, visual effects are impactful and communicative, but don't overwhelm the screen, usually. Combat is responsive and greatly varied, based on your build, the current creature composition, and the environment. Sound effects are impactful, and the feedback you get from getting a backstab never gets old. Can you give me your back? Thank you. It's so good! It also has an incredible amount of variability and build diversity that is reasonably well balanced due to the immense number of weapons, weapon skills, spells, and incantations. Pair that up with a diverse creature palette, and you have a combat and progression system that's strong enough to stay engaging for dozens of hours and is the linchpin of this game.
Oh, he got me good!
From a design perspective, do not underestimate how difficult it can be to make a combat system that feels this good. There are so many subtle design decisions that can grossly affect combat in a negative way if done poorly, but it will blend into the experience unnoticed if done well. Dance! Once! Like making attack animations that feel weighty but largely unrestraining, or determining how much the player moves forward with each attack to enable the animations to look good, but to not have the player push through or past their targets when chaining multiple attacks. It is very hard to make combat that is this good and this grounded. Relatively grounded. But even amazing combat will spoil quickly if it's not supported by solid progression or itemization, which this game has, in terms of its item drop rate, power scaling and item properties, and the different builds and playstyles that items can enable. And that same great pacing applies to the overall player level progression. All of these things help keep the core gameplay loop, with the combat at the center of it, fresh and rewarding throughout the entirety of the playthrough. And overall, I'd commend the gameplay design team for making a reasonably well-balanced game. There are a lot of viable builds out there, which is pretty impressive. There are always going to be outliers on either side, good or bad, but it's the player's choice to take those builds. From Software obviously spent an enormous amount of time and money developing its combat and related systems for Elden Ring, and it shows. Now on to an area where From Software probably, hopefully, didn't spend quite as much money on, the UX. Now, I love Elden Ring's minimalist heads-up display. It showcases the environment, it's usually clear in communicating health, resources, spells, and effects, and its lack of quest tracking actually helps mask how simple and often repetitive some of the quest objectives are. It's good, but I'm going to be using UX to refer to the systems that extend well beyond the HUD, to include the menu system and tutorialization. And my criticisms of the game's menu system might seem like nitpicks, but there are a lot of nits that need to be picked. And though I've largely gotten used to the game's menu system, perhaps because I'm an idiot, yeah, that's probably it, I was still losing items in my inventory over 100 hours into the game. Though this may seem like a minor area to critique extensively, it was my experience with the game's UX, when contrast with the game's combat, that really shone a light on the value of Elden Ring from a pedagogical perspective. The difference in quality of some of the game's system is so gross, yet that might not actually be relevant to the quality of the overall product. I can imagine how playing Elden Ring may make some UX designers question their design sensibilities and their contribution to a game's overall success. Now, I don't particularly care about UX in games, but in the spirit of trying to be empathetic to that one disgruntled UX designer, let's have a look at a few UX features that caught my attention because of either how they are implemented or the fact that they weren't implemented. Sites of Grace originally didn't have a notification for when you had enough currency to upgrade your flask's potency or its number of charges. Flask names have the same starting consonants and can be very difficult to distinguish when you're in tense situations.
God fucking damn it! Wrong flask!
There is no pausing the game even when you're in offline mode. Prompts for conversations with NPCs at Sites of Grace aren't always highlighted, making it very easy to miss important story information. Shame on you for not being able to spot the new grey text amongst this wall of other grey text, because change blindness is not a real thing. Consumable runes originally didn't have a description of their value, requiring you to either consume them or use a vendor to find out how much the runes actually contained. And using items like consumable runes closes the game menu, so that if you don't use enough runes to level up or purchase something, you need to open the menu, find and consume the runes again. When purchasing from a vendor, the game doesn't provide data on the vendor's item stats versus your item stats. Item descriptions are hidden under the aptly named Switch Display Mid button. The game sorts items into what sometimes feel like arbitrary categories, thus storing them on different menu screens. This gives opportunities for idiots like me to forget what type of item they just picked up, especially when picking up multiple new items.
Oh man. Once stuff goes in the inventory, it's fucking gone forever. It's lost. Like, I don't know where to find it.
There's no indicator or glow around new items you've picked up, making them very difficult to find once you've remembered what tab they're actually on. And sorting by order of acquisition keeps your cursor on its current item, which often lands you in the middle of a massive inventory of items, and also puts the new items you've acquired at the bottom of your inventory list, because items you've acquired first in the game are obviously more relevant to your current search than the item you just picked up. I want to take a special moment to appreciate just how much it sucks to find things in your inventory when such a significant portion of the game's lore is delivered through item description, which requires you to pick up items, which often happens in the middle of combat or in multiples, remember what subtype the item is, key item, tool, etc., navigate to the item type menu, then find that item within the tab when there is no visual indicator for new items, and sorting items by order of acquisition puts new items at the bottom of the screen.
Oh, you sack of shit!
Now, you may be thinking,
Not a big deal. Just overreacted.
and I'd say, yeah, you're probably right. But the extra special thing about UX design is that many of its features are largely static. Unlike an instance of weak level design, which you'll play once and then move on from, a bad menu system is going to stay with you the entire game. Players who are trying to understand Elden Ring's fragmentary lore are going to be spending a lot of time in the menu system, and it's not a good experience. Part of the reason I started playing this game was to see if I could empathize with the frustration of those few vocal developers who criticize the game. And if I were a UX designer, playing this as the game of the year, I might have some sort of existential profession crisis. I kind of imagined that it'd be like being a car designer who thought it was important to have a sleek car that had an intuitive and clean dash, but then the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile that's owned by a hoarder wins Car of the Year. Each time you want to drive somewhere, you have to step into a cabin that smells like spoiled salted meat, navigate with a touchscreen made of ham, and grab a steering wheel made of hot dogs. On road trips to your item description, both the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile and the luxury car will get you to your destination, but the journey in the luxury car will be far more pleasant, faster, and more efficient. Those familiar with From Software games may have become accepting of the inefficiencies of the game's menu system, and I admit, even with my silly brain, I became more fluent with its use through my extensive playthrough. But when a player hasn't become accustomed to the oddities of the game's menu system, they're bound to become annoyed while they go through the relatively long adjustment period. So, how did Elden Ring end up with this menu system? Well, the UX designers probably looked at the menu system in Dark Souls 3, thought, good enough, and then plopped it into Elden Ring while deciding to make some of the buttons even less intuitive. Seriously, the button was called Show Item Info in Dark Souls 3. Why in hot honey ham was it renamed to Switch Display Mid in Elden Ring? And though I'm baffled by some of the design decisions that went into the menu, when developing a game, both time and money are almost always tight. So it's hard to make an argument for spending huge amounts of money redesigning a system that's already functional and relatively easy to borrow, especially when the returning fanbase is already used to the design, no matter how inelegant it might be. In addition to being, interesting to use, the game's UX is almost comically understated in some ways. Like the amazing stinger that plays when you first level up your Flask of Tears.
Increase amount replenished by flasks? Totally! Yeah, oh my god, that was so, lackluster.
Presenting the players with a beautiful brown box of text instead of some small stinger or mini cinematic or flash of light or something. Or the epic climax to the many stepped questline of Millicent when you return Michaela's needle. There's no dancing Korok as you upgrade your spell slots. No flash of light when you level up. It's all very muted. Initially, I assumed this may have been a cost-saving mechanism, but this game has no shortage of VFX that could just get hacked together to serve probably any purpose. So this may have been thematically intentional to keep everything grounded, but I really don't know. The game's tutorialization, which can be a feature under the purview of the UX team, is okay, I guess? It's not the most educational or informative, nor is it particularly engaging or effective at ensuring that players are well introduced to many of its systems. Much of the game's tutorialization occurs through text and image pop-ups at either pre-scripted points in the tutorial level, or when the player first accesses a particular item or menu feature. And that's not uncommon in games. But Elden Ring slaps you with a lot of these items in a short period of time, and only a few of them, like jumping, actually require you to perform the action in order to advance. This makes it pretty easy to misunderstand a skill or feature, move on, and then never use it properly or at all, until a commenter lovingly points out that you're an idiot. Some of these systems may be intuitive if you're a Souls veteran, or you consider Google search as part of your intuition, but they won't be obvious for all players. In the approximately 30-minute tutorial section, the game generously gifts you with 19 screen-obscuring pop-ups, each tutorializing different skills and features, which isn't horrid. But when trying to intuitively understand the flow of the game and become immersed in its world, being presented with text pop-ups every 90 seconds really pulls one out of the experience.
A row of fruit. So what do we do with this row of fruit? I'm guessing the row of fruit. Oh my god. Ugh, so much reading. Okay. Good to know. Adding. Oh my god, so much reading.
And it makes it pretty easy not to internalize their contents. The game doesn't require you to demonstrate mastery, or even an understanding of most systems in order to advance. You don't have to craft some item in order to move along the critical path, or to use a spirit summon to open some impassable door. It doesn't require you to perform 3 guard counters on an enemy, or present some enemy that can only be beaten by some sort of magic or ranged attack. And I don't want to suggest that quest gating tutorials are the gold standard, but for illiterates like me, having that reinforcement would have helped me be more proficient with the game system and likely less reliant on external information. I'm assuming they took this approach to the tutorial for one of several reasons. 1, maybe it's money? Tutorializing the player on the nuances of the game systems primarily through text boxes is much easier and less expensive than creating levels that educate the player on game systems almost entirely through in-game diegetic means, as you see above. Levels like this are really expensive to make. 2, the developers may have deemed an immersive, robust tutorial unnecessary, as Elden Ring plays very similarly to previous From Software games, so returning players would pick things up quite easily. Or 3, the internet. The developers know that anytime the player needs information on game systems, they'll probably just look it up on the internet. Why spend a ton of time and money integrating a robust, well-designed tutorial into the game when they can outsource that work to the community? For free! Relying on player-generated content to deliver accessible guides and information on how to use game systems feels a little lazy. And for the small minority of players like me, who aren't die-hard fans of From Software, and were attempting a blind playthrough, the game's method of tutorialization makes it likely that one will either be unaware of, or will misunderstand how to properly use some of the game's systems. In From Software's defense, this is probably a pretty smart reallocation of funds. This may be a realistic way to look at how players learn game systems nowadays, as metagaming has become the norm. Look at this absurd number of build guides that are available on just one website. They wouldn't be producing them if people weren't using them. Although I don't like Elden Ring's method of tutorialization, I understand probably why they did it. Alright, I guess that's it for part 1. I wasn't planning on making this into a video series, but apparently I can talk incessantly about inconsequential things. So, join us for part 2 of this retrospective on Elden Ring, whenever I happen to finish it. I can almost guarantee it will be lower quality in any measurable metric than this video, because this video took way too long to make. If, for some reason, you want to watch a game designer do a long play of a video game that he assumes he won't enjoy, but actually does end up enjoying, feel free to check out my painfully long playthrough of Elden Ring. But just a warning, my commentary in the first few, perhaps even few dozen videos is pretty shaky. If you join me on another video, then I'll see you later. And if you don't, I hope you have a nice life. Take care.